Episode 4. I am one of your hosts, Brian Hogan, here with my co-host, Morgan Barbrett. I won't speak for her, but I am both a hot mess and a life coach, and I think that's perfectly fine. And we're going to talk today about greed. We're going to go deeper even into emotions, and greed is a bit of a tricky one. Morgan, how are you this morning?
I'm doing decent. I'm a little foggy in the brain, but I'm ready to talk.
Right now, welcome. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So,
All right.
yeah, go ahead. Did you want to jump in?
Well, I was just gonna say that, obviously, when Brian and I are preparing for these podcasts, we always kind of do our research. We look into different, factoids about the various emotions, and greed is like a really interesting one because even though it does have like very clear sensations in the body, it's also kind of like conceptual and cultural in nature. So we'll talk both about like the dimensions of greed, like as it's experienced as an emotion, and also like culturally what kind of creates that on a broader scale.
Yeah, exactly. And to that point, like greed is everywhere, right? So like the idea that it has been created on a broad scale is entirely relevant to this discussion. Like we've been talking about how each individual will navigate the emotional experience that they have and work with that emotion. Greed is different because there is the individual experience of that, of feeling greed, but there's also the cultural understanding of greed as an enshrined value. Like
Mm-hmm.
greed is really, really tricky for us because we're taught by culture. Uh, we're taught greed by culture, basically, but we're also taught by that same culture that greed is wrong. So like we're being set up to fail by this culture that says like go get, go achieve, go find. It's capitalist. We live in this society that's like about navigating how much stuff you have, even comparing yourself and your worth based on how much stuff you have in relation to other people. So that's all there, that's all inherent, that's all like that's the invisible like unspoken messaging that we swim in. And
Mm-hmm.
then we get the verbal messaging of, don't take more than your fair share, you should share, all that stuff, right? So we're literally we're living in an environment where there's a moral dimension to greed that's seen as like, ooh, stop that. But then there's a
Mm-hmm.
cultural dimension to greed that's seen as like, ooh, go get him, tiger. So,
Mm-hmm.
how do we then navigate what that means and where did that come from? And there's a theologian, I'm not going to get his name all messed up, Reinhold Niebuhr or something, but
That's a name.
I definitely got it wrong. He's talking about how greed is sort of evolutionarily part of human nature now because we're the animal on the planet that has this unique ability to understand our mortality. And so like every other
Mm-hmm.
species, we're an animal, we have to meet our needs, we have to survive, but we also have to live with the knowing and understanding that we could die at any second. And so because
Mm-hmm.
of that, there's this like felt sense of anxiety in the
Mm-hmm.
body, even unconsciously in the psyche of the human being. And this, it sort of creates like this existential anxiety, which I found that discussion to be really, really interesting because like humans are both like nature, like every other animal, and spirit in the sense that we can analyze what's going on in our lives and like see
Mm-hmm.
it from the outside perspective. And so that kind of uncovers, that's a spiritual way of looking at what the science that we've been researching sort of validates, which is that anxiety is a driver of greed. And it's like
Yeah.
we've had this species wide anxiety for millennia of like, am I going to die by tiger? You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
that greed then in that sense in those early years was adaptive for each individual or each clan or each tribe to add a sense of certainty, to add a sense of enoughness to a very sort of barren landscape of survival when you know you're going to die.
Yeah. So in other words, greed increases your chances for survival, and it's an emotion that stems from feelings of or fear of scarcity.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Like thinking about where we are on the planet right now, it to me it's almost like greed, the way that greed has sort of taken over, if you
Mm-hmm.
will, Western culture and maybe even more pervasively other cultures. It's like a massive trauma response to what we have been through as a species. You know what I mean? And
Well, also a response to increasing inequality, I think, too.
yeah, I mean that's where it becomes like a cycle, because it's like we've had to survive like sort of the onslaught of nature. That was like equal playing field. Everyone had to survive that. And so we've sort of become greedy as a result of that. And as we move forward in history, right, like now the greed then perpetuates on itself because it causes more and more inequality, which then causes more and more scarcity and more lack, which is an anxiety
Mm-hmm.
driver, which then adaptively makes people want to be greedy. So
Mm-hmm.
the adaptive part of it is like when you actually don't have enough, like it's not greedy. It becomes greed later when you do have enough and you don't shed off that pattern of like searching for enough. Like
Yeah, but
that's
it's the
where,
emotion of greed, like in the beginning when you're, I mean, like it's not greedy, but it's like still the same kind of emotion and anxiety that's telling you like I need more resources. But the time when it becomes a problem is when like you have way more resources than you need and then you still want more and then you get to some sort of threshold which we're not quite sure where that is and it varies from depending on what culture you're a part of or where you're living or how much you already have, etc. But you get to a threshold where you achieving any more resources potentially negatively impacts somebody else's ability to gain resources that are essential for their survival or their just relative um, standard functioning.
yeah. So this is an interesting like sort of describing greed, the emotional quality of when you're feeling greedy, like when you're feeling the feelings of greed. It's important, I think, as we talk about that, to separate the hey, I happen to be feeling greedy, which really is it's an after effect of feeling desperate, right, and feeling
Mm-hmm.
like there isn't enough. That feeling from actually greedy behavior on a moralistic sense, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
so you can have that feeling of greed
Yeah.
for whatever the English language is so clunky, so it's hard. I wish there were more nuanced terms for this, right? But like that
Mhm.
feeling, the emotional sense of the greed, the desperation, the clinching that comes along with like feeling like you don't have enough.
Yeah. Heightened heart rate, tense like shoulders and other muscles. Those are
Yeah,
all,
and
yeah.
that is useful as a way for us to qualify, oh, this is me feeling a sense of greed right now because I can feel those qualities, and
Yeah.
that has nothing to do with being immoral or bad or wrong. Like just that
Yes.
feeling of greed, it's a warning sign like any other emotion. Like if you feel remorse, like that's a warning sign that you might have to back up and apologize or
Yeah.
take a different track. If you feel that feeling of greed, that
Yeah.
may
It's
be a
not bad to
sign.
feel it.
Yeah, it might be a sign that actually I need to go search for more resources in the external world, or it might be a sign that, oh, I have resources in the external world, but I'm not actually taking care of myself enough. And so
Hmm.
the gulf in me that used to live in scarcity and lack for real, that
Yes.
doesn't live in scarcity and lack now, is still driving the train.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a tough thing because greed, you're not wrong to be greedy, right?
Or to
If
feel greed.
so you're not wrong to feel greed if you like, it's the age old question, like, is it wrong to steal a loaf of bread if you're going to use that loaf of bread to feed hungry homeless children? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, but truly, right? It's like that act, that quote unquote greedy act is at the same time a selfless act, right?
Hmm.
So there comes this time where it's like, okay, I'm feeling that greedy feeling, but I actually don't have enough, versus I'm feeling that greedy feeling and I have way more than I need.
Yeah. I think the way that this gets balanced out is like if we can be conscious of like the emotion of greed, then we can also be conscious of when and if it um butts up against or gets into conflict with like our other emotions of like compassion or love, or I guess empathy is not necessarily an emotion, but there is research that shows that the more material wealth you have and the more like deep desire for material things you have, it has an inverse relationship with compassion and empathy,
Hmm.
which which is an issue because that means that if you have a lot of excess wealth, and there are easy ways to kind of like combat that and like remove that impact, but without reminders of our innate connection to other human beings, without like stimulants for empathy, then greed can lead us to this place where we forget to care about other people. And so like it's good to be aware of it, and then it doesn't become a problem if you're consciously stimulating these other emotions that protect you against strictly self-serving behavior.
Yeah, and that's I think you're so right on about that, and like to take that even one step further, like in order to prompt those emotions that help you care about other people, you actually also have to be nurturing the emotional qualities of deep care for yourself. There was an article I came across that called it spiritual selfishness, and it was
Mm-hmm.
actually an article that was distinguishing between spiritual selfishness and greed, and
Okay.
it kind of provided the idea that the link is like greed actually comes from having too little spiritual selfishness, like too little inner
Oh,
selfishness. Like not the like greed comes from a lack of being self-ish, like self-ish, like self-like being more attentive to the self. And so if
like
you
less mindful?
like becoming more mindful, like when you spend more time with the self, tuning into the self, like
Yeah.
what the actual qualities are that you need, like tuning into uh where am I struggling emotionally right now? What are my
Yeah.
unmet needs in the internal landscape, as opposed to
Yeah.
like, am I hungry? Like, because we're talking about at this point, if you have enough resources and you're still dealing with this,
Yeah.
that's greed that's run amok and is no longer adaptive. So it's in
It's
that.
because you have anxiety and discomfort that you're then trying to subdue that discomfort by getting hits of dopamine and triggering your reward centers in your brain, and like comforting whatever uncomfortable emotions you have that could also otherwise be addressed by being mindful and like enhancing your spiritual wealth.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. So
Okay.
it's like instead of we go greed to comfort the internal landscape without realizing that's what we're doing. And instead we can just go
Yeah.
to the internal landscape and say, what does my internal landscape need? And the answer is not another Amazon Fire Stick. So it's like, you know what I mean? When we do really take notice of what is driving me to want the thing, we can then go in
Uh-huh.
and give ourselves the real thing that's needed, not the external thing that's a bastardized approximation and will never really work.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have an Amazon Fire Stick, Brian?
I do. Yes, I do. Just the one. Just the one. I have enough of them now.
It was too specific of an example for you to not have one.
Yeah, because I'm looking at it. It's like right there. So
Yep. Yep. Very nice.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, so we talked about greed having, at times a little bit of an inverse relationship with spiritual wealth and also compassion and empathy. It also has a direct relationship, so direct correlation with another emotion, which we may or may not cover on a different episode, envy.
Mm.
The more the more intense your desire for material wealth, the more likely you are to feel envy towards anyone else who has things that you don't have. And that is not ever capped by how much or how little you or the other person has. I remember I I think this was like late college, or no, it was like middle of my college years. I briefly talked to and dated this guy who like lived in like this multi-million dollar house, and like I was just getting to know him. We were just like talking, and it became very clear to me that this guy didn't understand how wealthy he was. Um and so he took me to this yacht club. Again, somebody who claims to not have any privilege whatsoever. He took me to this yacht club, and he was like, "Yeah, like we're not rich because we don't have as big of a boat as these other people." I didn't end up like fully dating this person, but I was like,
Why? You sound like a total catch.
no, no. I mean, he was a nice guy, but it just there was so much cognitive dissonance. But what I'm saying is like envy, like will show up regardless of how much material resources you have, and sometimes it happens more intensely when you have more material resources because it's like easier to tell like who has more than you. So there could be people that are in the top half of 1% of, the level of wealth in the United States that will say I'm middle class
Mm-hmm.
because I can point to people who are richer than me, even if that's only going to be the top 0.001% of people.
Yeah, which is so strange because they could also point to like 100 times more people that are poorer than them, but that
Right.
goes totally unnoticed. And that's because this whole season we are in the terrain of emotions. We are in the landscape of emotions, which
Yeah.
means, for better or worse, we have left behind the world of the rational and the world of the sensical. And so, it would make sense to stop being envious when you catch up to somebody, but that's not how it
Yeah.
works. As soon as you
Well,
catch up to somebody, you notice somebody else that's ahead of you and your envy transfers there.
and if I were to ask myself like why is that? Like why would that be the perspective that the brain attaches to? I think it has to do with environment. Just whatever environment you're in. And I think this also explains why um greed and empathy have inverse relationships, because when you have more material resources, you are going to land yourself in environments where other people have more material resources. And so your perception of reality is going to be skewed based on who are the people that are around me. That
Mm.
forms your understanding of what is normal. And so you just learn to assume that everybody else has, or the majority of people has a similar amount that you have, when that is not reflective of the broader society. And if you're not actively looking at like, politics across the world, which usually in the United States we're pretty just like United States centric. We don't look at other cultures as much as other countries do. Um, your understanding of what we have and how it relates to what other people have and how much we should have is not actually normal in the grand scheme of the planet.
Yeah, I mean it's not rooted in actual necessities or
Yeah.
needs. It's
Mm-hmm.
rooted again in this emotional landscape of the irrational, which is
And
why.
Western capitalist culture.
Yeah, well, and one could argue that Western capitalist culture is highly irrational.
I
In
would agree with
terms of,
that.
yeah, you would or would not.
I would
Uh,
agree with that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, just in turn, like, look at the way it's look at where it's taking us. You know what I mean? Like, we're at a place right
Mm-hmm.
now, speaking of greed, we're literally at a place in our planetary evolution where, despite how many people are lacking right now, our
Mm-hmm.
species has enough. Our species has more than enough. Our
Yeah, that
species
could
has
be
more than enough.
distributed.
Yeah, we have more than enough in the way of technology and resources and knowledge and understanding to make it so there's no need for hunger or war or poverty. Like, that's actually possible at this time
Yeah.
in history with the technological advances that we've made. We just simply don't want to yet. That's
Yeah.
that's greed, and that's where greed has taken a root in. And this is goes to the next thing about greed, actually, that I wanted to bring up, which is that there's like an addictive quality with greed too. Like, because greed is so connected to anxiety, like, the then the anxiety is driving you. So the richer you get, right, the higher you go, the harder you fall, is like what people think when they have anxiety. And so then they become addicted to the process of acquisition, because that
Mm-hmm.
keeps the anxiety at bay. And so
Yeah.
that's a part of the reason why, like, people like Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street, and like those actresses that bribed colleges to let everybody in. Those stories have sort of come under scrutiny in the scientific communities because they've been a little bit like, what drives someone who obviously has enough and more than enough to execute a behavior that could land them in jail? Like, why that level of irrationality?
Mm.
Do you know
Oh,
what I
that's
mean? Like,
interesting.
because
Yeah.
like the greediest of the greedy in our society are people who like they run top corporations and they get caught and they end up in jail or they have to pay millions of dollars in fines for some greedy shit they did. And it's like, why? Why would they do that when they were already a
Yeah.
millionaire or already a billionaire, right? Like what
Because those feelings intensify.
and it becomes an addictive quality because like
Yeah.
because it's the feeling of pleasure comes from the process of pursuing the reward as much as it does from like getting the thing at that point. Like that's what becomes wired in the brain is like, oh, this
Yeah.
is where the gambling addictions are just as strong as like an addiction to caffeine, for example. You know what I mean? There's no
Yeah.
substance.
Yeah.
The substance is the dopamine in your brain. And so that sort of, I mean, thinking about like as a kid, like how much we look forward to Christmas, like sometimes that's only joy and purity, but other times there's that like ravenous, let's get to that day thing. That's not me judging kids. Like I still feel that way, and it makes sense that kids would feel that way. But like
Hmm.
that's the beginnings of like the quality of greed that gets us away from the adaptive nature of it. Like it's adaptive
Yeah.
until you have enough, and then we it's just an example of how Western capitalist cultural society sort of programs like desires run amok in us. Like think about what Black Friday is all about. Like literally
Hmm.
years ago, there were people that got trampled. Like that's literally we've trampled each other for flat screen TVs over greed because we're addicted to it. Like there's no reason you would trample somebody for a flat screen TV if you were in your rational mind.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, and I think a lot of it comes from like part of how greed gets enculturated. I don't know if that's the right word, but like how part of how we learn it is by receiving messaging that tells us that we are not enough unless we have more. And therefore we need more in order to be enough, which that messaging exists in culture because we have a very profit driven culture. And the only way that you can get people to buy more and more and more without end is by generating that fear and by sending messaging, usually through advertising, that you are not enough unless you get this thing.
Exactly. You are not enough. That messaging is exactly why inner self work, inner self care, fostering self awareness, and getting an understanding of your values is the antidote to greed because greed is like driven by I'm not enough. But self understanding and self awareness causes a feeling of internal enoughness when practiced.
Yeah. And then you can't be as easily influenced by those external messages because you don't have any fear for them to trigger.
Yeah, exactly. Or you're less triggerable, right? Like in
Less triggerable.
until
Yeah,
you become
usually you would
advanced
still
in
have some
nature.
amount of fear.
I mean, one day, like let's
Yeah.
all head towards enlightenment. Like enlightenment is this like woo woo concept, but it's actually totally possible for human beings on the planet. And like I'm not
Hmm.
enlightened, not even close, but I'm not going to pretend I'm not trying to get there because I am.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I
Yeah.
want that because it's lighter. You feel lighter. That's the whole point. It's you're
Yeah. It's just
lightened.
just a crap ton of peace, crap ton of love. Who
Yeah,
wouldn't want that?
yeah, exactly. So a personal story for me. When I was a kid, I collected action figures, and I
That doesn't
loved
surprise
them.
me.
Yeah, and it like that was like I mean, I don't know, I loved superheroes. I still love comic books and superhero movies and all that, and like I had this growing action figure collection all through my childhood, and they brought me so much joy when I was a kid. Like the whole
Yeah.
thing started in joy,
Yeah.
but it became anxiety driven later,
Mm.
and therefore it became greedy because there was a point in my later development, like in my early 20s and stuff, where I didn't need them. Like you could say I didn't need them as a kid either, but like kids do need play. Like, humans do. We need play in that. So like in a
Yeah.
sense, I would make the argument that as a kid I did need them because they're appropriate for your development. But in my
Hmm.
20s and stuff, like I didn't need them anymore. But they brought me something else. It was this sense of security, this sense of belonging, this sense of completion because you got it, you
Hmm.
got that last one of the set, or like an accomplishment because now you have all the sets and stuff like that. And so those values, security, completion, accomplishment, like those are the things in like enshrined by culture, right? And so
Yeah.
it became in me an anxiety driven pursuit to get the next action figure in my young adulthood, whereas in
Yeah.
my childhood it was a joy driven pursuit to play with them. And there became a time where I wouldn't even take them out of the box, you know what I mean? So it and I'm not saying if you're a person who collects action figures and you won't take them out of the box, this is not a judgment of you, like at all. It's about the internal states of being. And like for me, it was no longer a habit that was bringing me joy. It's like if you're a collector and it's bringing you joy, more power to you. I
Yeah.
I it shifted for me from being a joy to being an anxiety thing, because what I was doing was placing on that childhood pursuit the feelings that I should have been getting in childhood from family connections. And right. And so
Mhm.
instead in adulthood, that became a sort of a pathology. And I have since like let that go. But it's the reason I'm bringing that up is because one of the things that I learned this week too is that greed also, like we've said, it's adaptive in certain situations. It's adaptive in childhood when you're in an environment where you're not sure if future resources are going to be there for you or not. Like, so in the
Mhm.
that state of uncertainty, greed then becomes adaptive because it helps you to get more, feel more certain, and calm down, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you're a child who doesn't have there's no moral qualms about it. It's like, give me more food so I'm not hungry, right? Like that's healthy. And so I grew up in an environment where sometimes we didn't know what was coming next. And like that did spill over into sort of an addictive, like anxiety driven greed behavior around certain things. And
Mhm.
one of them was action figures, and that just became a place for me to essentially externalize the self-care I needed,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. That's a really good example. I'm glad you brought that in.
Yeah. And honestly, still to this day, I sometimes miss my Batgirl.
Oh,
But I think I may get one of her at some point soon. And
yeah.
I could just have one of her like on my shelf.
That was your favorite?
Yeah. Yeah, she's my favorite by far.
Yeah. Hmm.
So, one thing I want to do is sort of there's an exercise people could do, like
Okay.
to get to know your values, right? So, it's like the whole thing here with greed is that it's everywhere and you can't get away from it right now, the
Mhm.
way society is. But you can shift from a primary focus on external desires and needs,
Mhm.
especially if your basic needs are met, and shift then to a focus on your internal or characteristic desires. Like
Mm.
it's shifting. This exercise will help shift you from what do I want to what do I want to be like.
Yeah.
So step one is, what aspects of a person's character do I value? So think about the people around you, celebrities, fictional people, historical people, it doesn't matter. People who you've admired in the past. And why do you admire them? And if the answers coming up for you are, well, I admire how rich they are, I admire their high cheekbones, that's fine. But we're gonna then that's not the layer, that's not the level yet, that so that's okay to admire those things, but then go below that and say, like, what do I admire, what are invisible qualities that I admire about people that are intrinsic to them, not their achievements, not their stuff, and not their physical attributes. So
Yeah.
those things are off the table. With those off
Yeah,
the
you want their character.
Yes, exactly. The character, like, are they generous? Are they tranquil? Are they whatever it is for you? Like, there's
Yeah.
infinite answers to this. So the thing is, like, really go inside and ask yourself, what are the things I admire? Because the things you admire are generally the answer to the question of what do I want to be like. And so once you understand what you admire, then step two is to ask yourself, what can I do today to move in the direction of one of those values? And this step, to be really clear, it's a super small step, like everything else we do in like coaching or self growth. It's not like, oh, I need to make some drastic measure, like donating half my fortune to blah 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 because I I
Mhm.
I value generosity. You know what I mean? Like, okay, so now
Mhm.
you're understanding that you value generosity, so that's fine. So then you want to take a step that feels ridiculously easy in the direction of generosity. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
nothing that's too challenging. There's this verse in the Bible that says God loves a cheerful giver. And while there are lots of things about the Bible that are for me, there are sometimes deep spiritual underpinnings that make sense. And this is one of them. Like giving from a place of obligation or whatever, it's gonna again produce anxiety. So you're in a sense re-traumatizing yourself. So you only want to take the step that feels as exciting and aligned as the value you eventually want to have in your life. So like
Mhm.
if it's exciting to you, to the idea that you could be more generous, then the step you take towards generosity should be equally exciting. And if it's producing like fear or dread or resistance, then lower the step until it feels equally exciting and take that step. And then
Yeah.
step 3 is tuning in and saying, how can I honor myself as I move in this new and uncomfortable direction? So step 3 and step 2 are a little bit intertwined in the sense that step 3 is basically like continuing to modulate the step you're about to take until it feels exciting and aligned, and then taking it. Like, what does your internal system really need from you as you're about to take new, uncomfortable, weird action? And then
Mm,
providing that internal self-care as you go forward towards your values for the first time, instead of just towards stuff.
mm. I like it.
Yeah. So here's a quote from Aristotle we can end with. For what good would,
Love Aristotle.
yeah, me too. For what good would their prosperity do them if it did not provide them with the opportunity for good works?
Hmm.
So it's the thing is here, the more we unwind our own proclivities toward greed, which are natural and evolutionary and at times adaptive, but when they're no longer adaptive, as we unwind them, we then get to be part of the force that helps unwind it in the world.
Mm-hmm.
We can't unwind greed in the world if we're trapped by the anxiety greed cycle within.
Yeah.
Any final words on your end?
No, I think Aristotle said it good.
Yeah, right on. Thank you, Aristotle, and thank you, Mo. Um,
Thanks, Brian.
yeah. So if you want to learn more about us and what we do, you can find us online. Morgan is online at selfloveatlas.coach or on Instagram at Morgan Barbrett. You can learn more about me and what I do at thebrianhogan.com. Otherwise, we'll be back next Friday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time to dig more into some other emotions. Until then, be hot, be messy, and be blessed. Much love, everybody.